Hello, my name's Adam Spring, and this is a Remotely Interested podcast hosted at remotely-interested.com. So, my rebellious band of remotely interested listeners, it's been a while, and there's been a few reasons for that. One, I've been busy, and two, I've been racking up the content, but also three, one of the interesting things about this podcast has always been that it's been a flexible format, and since I've been doing this, it's evolved over time. I've had co-presenters come in, I've had co-presenters go, and now, again, a listener reached out to me and they were like, why haven't you done any more? And I'm like, I just haven't had time. So now we have a new co-host, and that co-host is Ravi Abbott. Ravi, how you doing?
I'm good, Adam. I really love your podcast, and I've been listening to some kind of previous episodes, and there's some really interesting content on there.
Well, thank you very much. So before we talk about me, because I know you want me to talk about me, let's talk a little bit about you. So tell me, a little bit about your background and why you wanted to be part of Remotely Interested.
Yeah, so I'm currently on a podcast called The Retro Hour. Now, we do gaming and we talk about retro games. We have interviews with people every week, and I really love the interviewing. I think it's one of the favourite parts of the podcast, and that's a weekly one, so that will be out quite more regularly than this. But I find that I want to explore a bit more because we're limited to around an hour's worth of time, and that kind of means that we have to get all this information shoved in with an hour. I think it's going to be really nice kind of working with you because we can sit down, listen to the interviews together, and then go through them at the end. And it could be like, if you get an interview, I could get one in England, and we can use both countries to kind of benefit the podcast and really help people learn.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that's one of the things that I started this podcast because there's an element to me where I'm a communicator and I'm a connector, and I've done a lot of stuff, whether it's peer review publications, industry publications, videos. So to me, podcasting was another media and another way of reaching people. And one of the things that I found from doing this, which may be a little bit different to your podcast, because, for the listeners, you and I, we've known each other for a long period of time, and I knew about the Retro Hour before it even came about. In fact, you referenced me on episode 1, for example. And one of the things that was unexpected, and I think is slightly different with this podcast to the one that you've got, is that there's a broad spectrum of people that you can talk to, but also when you're getting information from them and even editing it back, there's stuff that sticks with you along the way, and you find interconnecting points in things that are otherwise disconnected. People I've had on here have been people that have designed some of the 3D laser scanning technologies I work with, as well as people like John Matheson, who designed the Atari Jaguar, for example, a video game console that you and I know well from back in the day, as we say.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because I've kind of found that similar pattern because we've done around 130 interviews now, so there's a lot of similar themes that you start to see, and it's stuff like stick at what you're good at and really kind of focus on that. And there's other stuff like if you're trying to work for someone to achieve something, don't kind of go for their goals. Maybe get some satisfaction out of it yourself. And if you've got more enjoyment of a project, then you're going to be more into it, and it's going to be more successful. So, I can see a lot of these themes crossing over, and the idea of remotely interested, it seems really good because even the name behind it, you just kind of, it could be a subject that you're just remotely interested in, but you'll find out more information.
Well, you can't really argue with it, can you? So that's the way it goes.
So I've been listening to the podcast, and I noticed one thing, Adam. You haven't actually told the guys about yourself. You're talking to a lot of people, but we don't really know your history, and I think that would be really interesting to talk about.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons for that is obviously when this started, I think it was in 2014 with Trevor, there was a co-host element to it. And then when I went out on my own, and that was simply because he moved, it wasn't really anything, there was no drama there. It's hard to talk about yourself, I'm not really an egotistical person. But for me, and I think this is where a lot of similarities between you and I come in, is my formative years in technology, because the way I would describe this podcast, it's a podcast about technology, people, and the intersection between technology, people, and culture. And for me, I think it's very similar to you. My formative years with technology was from around about 1985 to 1995 in the UK, where I think, looking back on it and having moved countries, now living in the US, we were very spoiled in the sense that we had an island culture going on. So basically it was easy to transmit information, but also I think British people in general were a nation of tinkerers.
So the whole idea of kind of British computing and stuff, and old British companies were really, we'll do everything ourselves. So there was a famous machine that was created in the 70s called the Leo, and that was actually made by Lion's Tea because they wanted to automate their office. So they said, why don't we just build this huge computer system and do it ourselves? And that was the kind of DIY, do-it-yourself philosophy in the UK at the time.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think, some of the people that you've had on your podcast, like the people behind From Bedrooms to Billions, I think one of the key things for that first film, and I do think the first film is worth a watch. The other ones are kind of like meh. I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but they're not as good as the first one. The key thing I think that came out of that, and they emphasize very well, is transistor radios were kind of instrumental in the 50s and 60s for laying the groundwork for that tinkering mentality. If you look at someone like Sir Clive Sinclair or anybody around that Cambridge scene, it wasn't just about the fact that you had a very strong university presence with a long computing presence and, Turing and stuff like that. It was also the fact that you had a core of people that weren't afraid to explore using stuff in a way that maybe you weren't or you wouldn't in a structured environment like a university. And I think tying back to my podcasts, if you listen to part 1 of Lee Felsenstein's stuff, and part 2 we've still got in the can, so we will put out at some point, the Homebrew Computer Club, they were not liked by the establishment. They were people that, the Altair 8800, that was run by a chip that was designed primarily for calculators and things like traffic lights. They repurposed stuff.
Well, these were kind of members of the public playing with machines that were meant for military, or they were developing something that was totally different. And I love that you mentioned radio as well, because I'm a massive radio nut. And some of the earliest radio transmissions were done across the Atlantic, but also they had a huge anti-establishment history of pirate radio in the UK as well, which was another kind of technology developed from kind of playing with something that we're not allowed to play with.
And I guess, an equivalent over here would be, but slightly different, would be blue boxes and, hacking old phone lines like the early Apple guys did, like, Steve Jobs and Wozniak did. Similar kind of rebellion.
You were in this kind of British hackery playing around, lots of crazy systems kind of computer upbringing. Then you went off to university. What did you study? So essentially, my pathway was always going to be either my love of the past, which, archaeology is what I ended up getting all my qualifications in, or going off and doing computer game design. And it's interesting because now I kind of feel like I'm at a point where I could kind of enter back into that video game world on that angle, on the back end, through the 3D imaging stuff that I do. But essentially all of my qualifications were in archaeology, but then by accident, not really by design, I ended up going back down that computing route by becoming involved with a type of technology called 3D laser scanning, particularly in the mid-range where you're dealing with things like buildings. And I got into that through the inscribed stone surfaces in my home county of Cornwall. There are a lot of them around. And one of the problems you have with a lot of these early medieval stones is the surfaces are heavily worn, particularly in Cornwall because it's granite. So it's weathered granite that was, carvings with crude sort of axes from like the 8th and 9th century. And for me, it was a way of potentially getting rid of the subjectivity associated with those axes, with those stones, sorry. So that's how I started getting into it. And then from there, really, it spiraled. I mean, I went from doing stuff in the UK to laser scanning Knossos in Greece, which is the second most busiest site after the Acropolis, done work in Albania. It took me all over the world, and I met my wife through basically what I did, and what I do. But then the funny thing was, it kind of came full circle one day when I'd moved over here, and Rebecca, that's my wife, she turned around to me. She's like, "You're not going to like me saying this." I'm like, "What do you mean?" She's like, "But
I'm pretty certain that all those computers and video game consoles are the reason why you got into what you're doing now. And I'm like, I'm insulted by the fact you think that I'd be insulted by that. So, it's absolutely 100%, I mean, I think one of the things I've always done is I've followed my interests, and the people that I've met through doing that, it's always taken me in the direction where I've needed to go. And that's on a subconscious level. It's not conscious. For example, you and I know each other through a blog post that I wrote back in 2013 on the Amiga computer. I was living in a very, how do I put it, sheltered, I will say, for want of a politically correct term, part of America whereby I wasn't just the only Brit, I was one of the only foreigners, right? So there was a big cultural divide there. And one day I was in my office because, when you can't look outward, you got to look inward sometimes. And I was looking down at my Amiga 1200 and I was like, well, I haven't really visited you in a while. So Rebecca was away on business for a couple of days. So I actually just stayed in the house, surrounded myself by 80s, 90s British culture in the background. I had like Sylvester McCoy, Doctor Who playing, and just did this blog post on the Amiga. And then that got around about 10,000 hits in the space of like 2 days. And you and your co-presenter Dan Wood for the Retro Hour, that's how I got to know you guys, because you were one of the few people actually doing decent content on YouTube of Amiga stuff. It was your interview with Trevor Dickinson, who now does the Aeon stuff, and the 4000 stuff that was some of the first stuff that I seen for you. And then Dan's stuff on, Amiga owners in 2011, I think was a video that caught me the most.
Well, one thing that you mentioned was basically laser scanning. And I find this very interesting because I've always been interested in different technologies like space, satellite, any kind of radio, long wave radio, and all the kind of amateur bands and everything like that. But laser scanning was something very different because I knew nothing about it, and then you sent me to a laser scanning conference, and it was so much fun. I really didn't expect it to be like that exciting, but it's really on the edge of kind of being integrated with virtual reality. It seems like it's on the edge of a kind of a cusp of a new technology and a new kind of way of integrating it with different stuff and displaying the pieces as well, and new accuracy as well. And I'd see geographers on the street with these big things in the kind of 90s and think, what's he doing? Why is he stood there for 10 hours? But now I can see it, and it really seems like they're something that can progress very well and very quickly at the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that conference that I sent you to. The largest conference in the UK is called Geo, because that was that, and basically bringing you in on some website stuff that we're doing for an educational program. More on that in the future when it's released. To me, it was kind of bringing two worlds together that I thought initially were otherwise disconnected, but they definitely weren't. And I think the key thing about laser scanning, so the type of laser scanning, as I mentioned, that I do is, well, really I can work with anything from as small as, say, a tooth, so on a micron level, to anything as big as a landscape, which can be captured in terms of meters, so I'm not restricted. There are people that see themselves as siloed, but I've never been, because I've always been so curious about the technology and its application. But I think the key thing about laser scanning is it gives you the ability to create a digital mold of whatever you are capturing. But the thing to remember about it is the accuracy, precision and resolution at which you're collecting the information and what goes into those processes. A 3D laser scan itself represents something called a point cloud, which if you think of a photograph where it has an X and a Y coordinate, so it's on a 2D plane, this is basically creating a 3D photograph, is essentially the way to look at it.
And you mentioned the accuracy there as well. Like, not many things in the world you can say this is fully accurate, but laser scanning, is it like 99% accurate or something?
Well, I mean, so that it's all relative, because there's a strong element to it that's to do with the user, right? The struggle between the user and the manufacturer, in the sense that you can have, say, a time of flight system. So the two main ways of getting a laser scan based point cloud is either through something called time of flight, where you're sending out a beam, and basically the time it takes to get back to the system roughly, and the pulse rate is how you get the 3D image. And then,
very much like when they put a mirror on the moon.
yeah,
And they bounce the laser off that and then use that to measure the distance.
Yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely tied in with that. That's one of the earliest examples. And then the other one is basically phase shift, which is so if you think of basically like Star Trek, and you think of when something's cloaked and it's not cloaked, it's in and out of phase with its surroundings. That's basically...
Oh, thanks for using Star Trek references. Well, I totally get that.
Yeah, I mean, back in the day, so, I got into this in 2006, and I'm classed as an early adopter, which I always kind of find funny because there are blaggers in this community, and I'm not one of them. I'm just very honest. But I am an early adopter, I guess, just to give myself some credit. Basically, in the early days, it was more difficult to explain phase shift than it was time of flight, because time of flight is relatively easy. It's a pulse beam and the time in which it comes back. But with phase shift, what you're looking at is the difference between the signal going out and the signal coming back. So that's why the Star Trek analogy is a good visualization, because if you think of something like, there was a Klingon cloaking device. When you can't see it, it's because it's out of phase with its surroundings. And when you can see it, it's in phase. So that's kind of the way to look at it. But both of those systems are called time-based measurement systems, because you're looking at time differences overall to give you the accuracy and the precision. And that's with laser scanning. That's why I use the term accuracy, precision, and resolution, because that's what's going into the parameters of that 3D image that you're collecting.
And it has so many different implications. That was the thing. I was sitting there and I was looking at some of the technology, and they had, for a start, they had... it was the 3D aerial images they'd had from satellites, and they had ancient maps, and you can kind of look through the layers of maps, and I thought that was great because it was like Google Maps with about 30 layers underneath rather than just your street view or your aerial shot. But also I just thought of stuff like event management.
Oh, absolutely.
If you were scanning an area and looking for the flow of people in a certain area, you could recreate scenarios, recreate disasters, recreate buildings collapsing, and use it for really good safety.
Yeah, and that's actually a very good example. I mean, stadiums as well. For example, the Mercedes-Benz Stadium, which you went to when we seen Atlanta United win the MLS Cup, that you could capture most of it within one scan, depending on what you needed. You can basically put the scanner in the middle of the stadium, and in one sweep you would get a lot of detail, because essentially the image that you're getting returned is all about line of sight. And when you're basically actively getting a laser hitting a surface, as long as it can get the information off of it, then you're golden. So essentially anything like that, people flow, and yeah, it's a very versatile tool. In robotics, this is a term that I probably like the most to describe it. They refer to it as the object environment, because when you're doing things like laser scanning or computer vision, the environment becomes an object, right? Anything like surface reflectance, the shape of an object, for example, what I would call firm geometry, something like a table or a couch, is going to be better to create an overall registered point cloud. So when you go from position to position, you can actually use the overlap of different point clouds to create one overall point cloud of an environment. So when you've got firm geometry in that environment, typically it's better than having softer, irregular surfaces. So think of like, things like a mound of gravel, or, anything that's soft and squidgy and things like that, that would be a mess.
Yeah. And all this, I guess, relates to kind of like everything that people are trying to do today at the moment, like augmented reality, virtual reality. They're all creating objects in there.
Well, I mean, I think the there was an Huffington Post article that sticks with me that was by Sir Clive Sinclair. I think it was around about 2016, 2017, and he talks about retro as the new. I think one of the problems you have with technologies, and one of the things that's been really interesting from doing this podcast, and I'm sure you've had the same with the Retro Hour, is the ideas remain the same. It's just the thing that you're doing changes, right? And it's that old quote of those who don't, look to the past are doomed to repeat it. I think a lot of this stuff, particularly around the AR and the VR space, you look around about the mid-90s, you had video gaming trying to push that space. You had things like, the Virtual Boy from Nintendo. You had a system that was going to come out potentially on the Mega Drive stroke Genesis that never did, and the same with the Atari Jaguar. And obviously you had the virtuality with the Amiga.
You know what amazes me? I think nowadays it's how easy and how willing people are to kind of drop a technology and move on to something that they see as the new thing and completely abandon all the old foundation of ideas and stuff like that.
Well, I think that's one of the really interesting things that I've had since moving to the US, because San Francisco I've spent a lot of time in, and I do love the Bay Area, but I've now lived here enough where I remember the last time that I was over there for Dev Week, blockchain was the latest thing. And I've never heard the term blockchain mentioned so much, but whenever you wanted to talk to somebody about what it meant, they didn't have a clue, most of them. And I think that's...
Yeah, it was like the hype word, wasn't it?
That's the thing. It's sort of, there's a knowledge economy and just, I guess, a hype cycle is probably what you would call it. Kondratьev's wave is another one. Yeah.
It's strange because I really didn't think, in 2019 that I'd be using Discord, which is exactly kind of like IRC or like a forum, or Twitter would still not be able to handle real-time video. It has to be a third-party add-on. If you want to do real-time text, that's still all that Twitter can kind of process in real time. And it's like, we're still quite far behind, but I just think things get repackaged and sold as a new technology.
Well, I think one of the things that I've learned from talking to a lot of different people about this stuff, and I would say one of the things I really value about being in the US is some of the real seasoned developers that I've met, whether it's a very good friend of mine who designed the first laser scanner that I ever used, or whether it was somebody like Dave Needle, who was somebody that designed, had a very strong hand in designing the Amiga, the Atari Lynx handheld, and the 3DO, is when you talk to people like that, you really do get an idea of just how hard it is to develop something, but also as well, it takes a certain mindset. I had a conversation with a friend of mine that works in a Canadian university a few weeks ago, and I'm like, most of the products we use today, why do you think they don't come out of universities? And, his response was basically, you can't, the entire structure of a university is not set up to innovating. And then you meet people like Dave Needle and my other friend, and it's just, they just think in a different way, right? Again, it comes back to that thing about tinkering.
Well, you talk about Dave Needle there, and he was an absolute excellent guy. You managed to get an interview with him before he sadly passed away. You've got quite a lot of interviews, like a good history with Remotely Interested. Which ones would you say your favourites are, and why?
So, Dave's is probably the overall one because it was a complete accident. It was done on a $30 Olympus dictaphone, on an old, it wasn't even a smartphone. This was when I was writing an article that ended up coming out in IEEE Annals of the History of Computing on the Amiga, particularly, on retrospective computing and how user communities can keep something going alive. That's probably my favorite one. And I think the reason why is, one, because Dave and I accidentally became good friends towards the end of his life.
Dave and RJ Michael ended up working together, and they created a lot on the Amiga. RJ was responsible for the Intuition on Amiga, but then also they went off and created the with Epix, they created the Lynx. So, there's a lot of history of those two as a team.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing about that story in general is, and the Amiga 30th event in 2015 in California, which I went to, was kind of telling for this because a lot of new information came out, is it wasn't just necessarily the both of them that traveled onto those projects, but also other people within that community of Amiga developers, like Carl Sassenrath, Dale Luck, and Glenn Keller. They all worked on the what became the Lynx, the Handy, and the 3DO as well, as did Stan Shepard. So it wasn't just some of them, it's basically a lot of them carried on, right? Because you're working with your friends. If you meet any of those guys, and I think it's a good point to make, because I think it's relevant in terms of bridging the gap between, discussing me and the stuff about laser scanning and, my formative years with technology. If you meet any of those guys, it's very clear that the guy, that was primarily behind it, Jay Miner and also Dave Morse, actually. Those two guys, they were very good at picking people that were not just work colleagues, they were friends as well. And that goes into a product. A lot of people tend to think that whether it's a computer or a laser scanner, that there's a sterility to product development. There really isn't. There is an element of people's personalities and what they see as needing to go into the product, and that struggle between bringing something out that actually shapes it. I remember I ended up having a meeting with somebody involved with Project Tango. In fact, it was somebody that was key to Project Tango, which was their Google attempt at their 3D imaging tablet. And it was funny because Dave actually worked on the power supply for the Project Tango. So I ended up going to this conversation with this guy with a load of prototypes in my hand, basically gave it back to the secretary at Google. Here you go. Here's the prototypes for these Project Tango. And within 5 seconds of walking into the room, it was very clear that it wasn't going to work, because it was a group of individuals trying to work as a collective. And there was, I won't go into it in too much detail because I'm too professional, but when you meet the people behind a product, you get a better sense of it and what goes into it,
Let's hear from Dave, and you can probably tell his passion behind his work here.
This was our family. We ate together. We went on trips together. We went river rafting. We did amazing, fun stuff together. We lived in those offices. There were times during the crunch that we slept at the office, and our wives came and brought clothes and food. And they joined in the work and in the joy of this creation. It was so amazingly close. Most of us are still friends. Most of us still talk to each other from time to time, even though we're physically separated. A couple of times a year, there's some kind of an event, and we gather up, and we all see each other and see each other's families and have fun. It is still a family.
So how'd you get to know these guys? One interview I really loved was Greg Dystra from Pixar, and talking about the animation and talking about the way of creating a feeling through a character, and there's tiny elements that are needed.
We do often, refer to whatever actor is going to be doing the voice, but more often than not, it's that actually happens too late in the process, and we've already designed the character, and maybe they're already built and articulated or rigged. That's when the controls are put into the digital model. But it's still, those actors can still influence basically the design, because as the animators who are the ones moving, this stuff, making those characters act, they can refer to those actors that are playing the part, and if there's cool little things that they do, they're very distinctive to them, that might make its way into the character, especially stuff that they're doing during the performance, because we do videotape the actors while they're doing their voice recordings. And so whatever little thing they might do during that time might make its way into the final animation. But for Bob, for instance, we actually just used each other largely. We had the original designs that Tony Fucilli and Teddy Newton and Lou had all worked out, and then my original sculptures from that. But then we had to, in addition to the face, we had to start figuring out what we were going to do with their muscles. This is a movie that not only had normal humans, but they had humans in tight, costumes. So everything was going to be shown off. And so we had to, I remember Tony Fucilli and I got into one of the offices and just started discussing anatomy and how biomechanics works, and how we could basically caricature that, just like we do the designs for a character's basic form, and so we would flex our forearm and decide, this can be represented with just one shape, but it's really important it deforms this way when the hand comes up, and so on and so forth. And we just kind of went through the human body that way, and we did take pictures of people, and we did a lot more of that on Ratatouille. But we do a lot with just people around the studio, and luckily Pixar's population was continuing to get bigger and bigger, and so we had a lot of people to choose from. And we still do that today. If we're looking for a particular kind of person, we'll see if there's someone at Pixar that can fit that kind of description.
So, Adam, you were telling me earlier that you had a big collection, a big backlog of interviews. Who have you got coming up?
So one person that's in the background that I'm looking forward to getting out is John Markoff. So John Markoff, a very famous technology journalist, and did a really good book on how counterculture informed and helped shape the PC revolution that came out of Silicon Valley. And that book was called What the Dormouse Said. So we've got John on talking about that. We've got Dag Spicer from the Computer History Museum in California. He's another one that's coming up. And then we've also got so for the last, talking in 2019, 10 years plus, really it was from the moment I picked up a laser scanner, I became curious by it. We've actually got a lot of the early developers of commercial laser scanning systems coming up, because I'm about to drop at some point in 2019 history of laser scanning, which has been done for the first time and has taken me 10 years to do it right. So we've got a lot of stuff coming up that's going to be very, very interesting.
Yeah, because I also have quite a few contacts here in Nottingham and in England, and I was thinking maybe of doing a few interviews of those, and then we could review them as well, so we could get a mix of a kind of transatlantic technology pioneers and technologists.
Well, I think that's the really nice thing I've found about doing this podcast, is it's such a flexible media to work in that there's room to do that. And I think the other thing as well that's really interesting about giving that fresh sort of angle to things by doing stuff like that is you learn new stuff that's useful and stick with you, right? One of the interviews I keep coming back to, and it's kind of weird now because I actually went and met up with him at NVIDIA back in 2018, is John Matheson, who was the hardware designer for the Atari Jaguar system, and he also did the new on as well. One of the reasons I find it weird is because that system, unbeknownst to me until I met up with John, had a very clear and deep impact on what I do now with laser scanning, in terms of not just the hardware, but also kind of what they were trying to, I guess the image they were trying to project at the time, or maybe this idea of the future and where the technology for gaming could have gone at that point in time with the 64-bit at the time of the great 16-bit systems. But when I met up with him, ironically enough, we only spoke about the Jaguar probably about 4 or 5 minutes, and we ended up talking more about the automotive industry, because he now works with some of the sensors that I use. In fact, when he was showing me around NVIDIA, pretty cool building, it's shaped like a polygon, so it's really difficult to navigate around because there's
nice.
a lot of right angles. Yeah, it's awesome. Fully recommend it. He took me to see a self-driving race car, because there's actually a self-driving race car lead that
because that's a real new area of industry, isn't it? The self-driving cars.
Yeah.
And they have been trying to do that since like the 70s as well.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And he was showing me around, and he's like, "Oh yeah, so here's a self-driving car," and I'm looking around it, and I'm like, "Oh, so these Velodyne sensors then in this thing, are they?" And he kind of looked at me, he's like, "Oh, how do you know that?" So it's funny how it was spooky in a good way, in the sense of, oh, I didn't realize that what you did back in the day had such an influence on me. You know?
We live in a huge world, but it all seems to be somehow connected. Wow. I think we're on a lot more services at the moment. So I've just been submitting us to Stitcher, and there's quite a few services like Tuned In that Remotely Interested should be available now. And we've done a bit of optimization on the old iTunes as well. So we would love it if you guys could drop some iTunes reviews, share the podcast. And we will be out monthly now. So are we going to be releasing in the first week of the month?
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. One of the reasons why you're here is to make sure I'm a good boy and we actually get them out. So,
yeah, so keep you on track. So thanks so much for listening to this introduction. And the next episode will be an interview with Adam, and then we'll review it afterwards.
Cheers, guys. On to the next phase.